Hello and welcome. Hi. My name's Nicole. I'm the Chief Curator here at Nottingham Contemporary, and I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening for our lecture by Gurminder K. Bhambra. Gurminder is Professor of Postcolonial and Decolonial Studies at the University of Sussex. She's the author of the publications Rethinking Modernity, Postcolonialism and the Sociological Imagination, and Connected Sociologies. And most recently, she was the co-editor of Decolonizing the University. Tonight's lecture, which is titled Whose Welfare? Colonial Regimes of Extraction and British Subjecthood, is presented as part of our campus program. Campus is our year-long independent studies program, which is focused on cultural, visual, and curatorial studies. We launched it just a couple months ago in October. It's a free program that brings together an intergenerational group of about 20 participants, which are drawn from a wide range of different backgrounds. And together we engage critical thinking around contemporary debates and cultural studies, and we think about how we learn and how we produce knowledge collectively. So each month, we invite a guest faculty member to contribute to a series of closed group seminars, as well as a public lecture. And tonight, we're honored to have Gurminder here to deliver the third in our series of campus talks. One idea that is central to campus is this idea of learning from the city. And we're very fortunate to be delivering campus together with a range of partners in the city, including Bonington Gallery, Backlit and Primary. And I'd also like to thank the University of Nottingham and Nottingham Trent University for their generous support of our public programs. A few additional housekeeping notes. Fire exits are located on either side of the room, and in the event of an evacuation, our staff members will direct you to the nearest emergency exit. Toilets are located just outside the door that you will have entered through, just on the right, and gender-neutral toilets are just a little bit further along in the cafe. And finally, we'll be recording tonight's session, so during the Q&A, we ask that you wait for the microphone, or if you prefer not to have your question recorded, just let a member of staff know. Before I hand over to Gurminder, I just wanted to bring your attention to our upcoming campus talks. Next up, we have a talk by artist Quincy Gario, and this will take place off-site at Bonington Gallery on Thursday, the 13th of February. And like all of our program, it's free to attend. So we hope that you'll be able to join us then. But in the meanwhile, please join me in welcoming Gurminder.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak and for all of you to come out this evening. The talk that I'm going to give has got sort of various parts to it. So I want to start off in part by talking a little bit about the decolonizing the university movement before moving into the main body of the talk. And it's in part because over recent years, there's been a real coalescence of movements, both in this country and further afield, which have organized themselves under the term decolonizing the university. So they really, I guess, start with Rhodes Must Fall and then Fees Must Fall in South Africa. And this was then taken up within the UK in Oxford, with students arguing for Rhodes Must Fall Oxford. And there were also movements and campaigns around why is my curriculum white, why isn't my professor black, organized by colleagues such as Nathaniel Tobias Coleman, Adam Cooper, and many, many others, but often students who are leading the way in relation to these sorts of struggles. And one of the things that was quite clear from the very outset was that as soon as these movements, these campaigns began to get any sort of traction, any sort of publicity, there was quite a strong backlash to the arguments that were being put forward. And this backlash was from media commentators, from politicians, from some academics as well. And it wasn't just in the UK. You may have heard of similar sorts of arguments being made in places as far afield as Hungary, Australia, Brazil, amongst many other places. And the key aspect of the backlash was really about warning against the threats that were being posed to the very foundations of Western civilization by seeking to hold the academy to account for the knowledge that it was producing. And so I think it's quite illuminating how quickly and how intense the pushback for change within the university has been. Now, the university, which is my site of being in a way, is, as John Dewey argues, one of the vital repositories of the common learning of communities. So this is not to suggest that all learning only occurs within the university, but what he argues is that the university is a really vital repository of the common learning of communities in the plural. And if we accept this understanding, then we should also recognize that perhaps what is at issue here is the fact that as the communities that constitute the university change, that's what concerns people more than simply the arguments around the knowledge that's being produced within them. Because as the communities that constitute universities change, so too then do the understandings that are produced within these institutions. And so what I'll suggest is that what people who seem to be concerned with is actually the changing composition of the communities that constitute universities. And I just want to use gender here initially as a way to illustrate the issues that I'm talking about, and also to point to how the concerns that are being raised are not just new in relation to decolonizing the university campaigns, but have actually been quite long-standing. So within the UK, universities only really opened up to women in mass numbers in the post-war period. And this was, and then specifically, I guess, after the mass reforms in the 1960s, which created new universities and which really opened up universities to different demographics. And one of the first things that women found as they entered these spaces was that women could not be found within these spaces. And I would suggest that just in the same way that women were not represented within galleries, except perhaps as objects of the male gaze, and not as producers of artistic commentary or producers of representations in their own right, the same sorts of issues were there in the university. And for some female scholars, this required address. It required address in terms of the curriculum, of knowledge production, and this was done by seeking to identify women not just as the objects of research, but also as the subjects of research, and by coming to argue for a feminist perspective across disciplines and other areas of study. And they address both what was to be taught, as well as who should teach it. And in the process, I would suggest that women transformed these institutions, or at least began the long process of transforming these institutions. Now, within the UK, it's not a mainstream opinion to suggest that curriculums or universities or art galleries are being distorted or disfigured by the inclusion of women or feminist perspectives. So what are we to make of those who criticize the call to decolonize our institutions? I would suggest that just as some men found gender equality a challenge to their sense of self, it's not surprising perhaps that those whose sense of self is intimately tied to the idea of empire having been a force for good in the world are unsettled by arguments to the contrary. In this context, what I find surprising is how they locate such criticisms as a form of identity politics, when it's quite clear that the only politics of identity being peddled here is their own. Now, let me just give you an example to sort of illustrate what I mean. Any number of commentators on being confronted with the trade in human beings often respond by saying, yes, it was bad, but Britain abolished the trade. Now, it's correct that Britain abolished the trade after about 200 years of profiting from it. But this isn't the only thing that was done. As Catherine Hall and Nicholas Draper have made publicly known, Britain also paid compensation of £20 million in the 1830s. In today's money, that would be about £65 billion, or the equivalent of 40% of GDP. This money was paid as compensation, not to those who had been enslaved, but rather to those who had owned other people, in compensation for their loss of property. So people weren't compensated for their loss of liberty, rather people who had owned other people's property were compensated for that loss. This money was used to fuel the Industrial Revolution, to build country houses, to endow public schools and Oxford and Cambridge colleges, and also to fund art institutions. In February of last year, the Treasury rather ineptly tweeted that we, that is British taxpayers, didn't finish paying off the bond that had been raised to pay out this compensation until 2015, because the amount of money that was given in compensation was so immense that there wasn't enough money in the Treasury at the time to actually pay out that money. And so what the government did was raise bonds from banks and other financial institutions in order to disperse the money immediately. And as taxpayers, we've been paying off that bond and the interest on that bond since the 1830s. And we didn't finish paying it off till 2015. So if any of you in the room have paid tax in Britain prior to 2015, some of your tax has gone to pay to compensate those people who had owned other people. And this isn't just British taxpayers, as in the British nation state, but it's taxpayers across the British Empire. So think on that for a moment. This fact around what the compensation was, who paid it, and who it went to, very rarely makes it into discussions of the abolition of slavery. Or if it does, there's usually some muttering about the rule of law and the necessity to compensate for the loss of property, however distasteful we might find the fact that people in a different time with different moralities had regarded it as legitimate to own other people. But this claim is not then usually followed by an argument that, well, actually we should have more general reparations to compensate all those across the colonial empire who had lost property. That is, those who were dispossessed from the land, whose right to property in themselves was taken away from them, or in compensation for the resources that were extracted from across empire. If the rule of law and the right to be compensated for the loss of property is central to who we think we are, is central to all articulations of British values, then why not generalize the process and compensate all those others? What's the obstacle to doing that? Saying that we know that slavery was wrong because we abolished it erases the historical narratives of those who had always opposed slavery, including successfully, as in the Haitian Revolution. It also pretends that we knew it was wrong prior to others telling us so, even as we argue that it's not possible to judge the past according to the standards of the present. So which is it? Because logically we can't have it the both ways. So the reason for presenting this example is to say that decolonizing the curriculum, decolonizing our production of knowledge, for me, is about transforming the common sense narratives that we have about how the world we share in common was configured. Our institutions of learning and of representation are complicit in such reproduction to the extent that they do not adequately challenge the politics of selective memory that is reproduced every time we evade our past instead of confronting it directly and honestly. In the main body of the talk, what I want to do now is to address arguments that are being made across the political spectrum that associate the projected demise of the welfare state with a rise in racialized migration. So there have been increasing claims about ideas of white replacement and questions about who is legitimately entitled to a share in the wealth of European nations. This has become a major part of political debate, not just in Britain, but across Europe. And it's reinforced by the histories that we narrate in public life and within our academic and artistic institutions. Whose histories and which histories we acknowledge is central to how we think about politics in the present. So, for example, one of the fundamental assumptions that's made is that there is something called the national patrimony. That is, wealth that's been accumulated over generations by citizens of this nation, which is now available for distribution to national citizens. And so it's this idea that this wealth has been generated by the activities of citizens over time, and its use and distribution ought to be regulated for the people whose contributions it represents. However, by the end of the 19th century, over half of the revenues that were available to the national government in Westminster came from the colonies and the broader empire, with 2/3 of this coming from India alone. So within the talk, I examined the broader imperial provenance of the material resources that are at the disposal of the national collectivity, and I raised the question of how the boundaries of citizenship come to be determined, such that some are included and others are excluded. In recent times, Brexit, perhaps more than any other political event, has highlighted the fracture lines for those who are interested in exploring them. Now, one of the things that's interesting about what's happened in the context of the debates that we've been having around Brexit is the history that gets acknowledged in the telling of this political moment. So if you cast your mind back to 2016, and it doesn't seem that long ago, but also an age ago, some of the arguments that were being made were very much about how what we needed to do was to reclaim our national sovereignty. And that one of the key aspects of Brexit was precisely about this claim to national sovereignty. But as I've long argued, Britain has never actually been a nation. So the entity Britain comes into being in 1707 as a consequence of the union of the kingdoms of England and Scotland. Both England and Scotland already have colonies, including that of Ireland, and further afield in Virginia and the Caribbean, that they bring to this union. Once they're established as Britain, they go on to conquer about 1/4 of the world's land territory. They govern over 1/5 of the global population, including, by the 1920s, 1 in 2 Muslims. And so, from the point of being British Empire up until 1948, when Britain transforms itself into the British Commonwealth, and then in 1973 it joins the European Economic Community, at no point in the 200 years of Britain has it ever been a nation state. It's always been an imperial polity, albeit with a national project at its heart. And this is a national project that is then deeply racialized. So we have a misunderstanding about who we have been historically, which is now distorting the politics of our contemporary moment. And in the context of thinking about what I was calling national patrimony, the idea is that somehow this money was generated by the nation and should only be available to the nation and not to invaders, to use the language of Wolfgang Streeck. And this is something, and he's a German commentator, and he makes similar sorts of arguments in relation to Germany. And you've also had the left-wing and high inverted commas economist Branko Milanovic making similar sorts of arguments. So the arguments that are being made on the sort of progressive, on the progressive side as well as the other side, is effectively that the wealth of European countries has been built up over time by the activities of national citizens within those countries, and it ought not now be made available to those who are coming from the outside. Branko Milanovic says, rich countries accumulate wealth and transmit it along with many other advantages to the next generation of their citizens. We take it as normal that there's a transmission of collectively acquired wealth over generations within the same nation. These sorts of sentiments are not new. They're part of a tradition of left thinking in the UK. For example, in the classic restudy that was done in 2006 called The New East End, Jeff Dench, Kate Gavran, and Michael Young argued that hostility against those that they called newcomers, effectively darker British citizens, was understandable because, and I quote, their families cannot have put much into the system, so they should not yet be expecting to take so much out. They go on to state that the metropolitan working class had been struggling for generations to share in the nation's wealth, and that this was now being made available too easily via the British Nationality Act of 1948 to the world's poor, that is, indigent outsiders. So within their work, they make a justification of resentment about newcomers, outsiders, having access to the British welfare state, despite also acknowledging, within the same book, that all classes within the metropolitan nation had profited together from empire. So the argument is effectively that all classes, including the working class, although that was uneven, the distribution, all classes within the nation had profited from empire. But those from empire who were now within the nation and who had come because in the 1948 British Nationality Act gave everybody the right to come, that they ought not to expect equality of access to the rights and benefits of the imperial state. And the question of those within empire beyond the nation wasn't even raised. This, I will suggest, is a political problem, but it's also a scholarly one. And it's the failure of social scientists and others to understand that Britain was an empire, rather than thinking about Britain having an empire. And that distinction between Britain being an empire, rather than Britain having an empire, is what I've called the methodological whiteness that's at the heart of our disciplines and generalized understandings. So in part, what I'm arguing here is that because most understandings of our past think about Britain as a nation which has an empire, it manages to disaggregate the connections that actually bind nation and empire together and which continue to have an ongoing effect in configuring the politics of the present. So what I want to do now is to discuss briefly these broader issues through a discussion of the standard history of capitalism, because in a sense, these arguments don't stand alone. They come out of our deeper understandings of how it is that we think that the world has come to be configured the way in which it has. The welfare state is seen to be an outcome of a particular history of capitalism that in itself doesn't recognize the histories of colonization as central to the ways in which we think about capitalism. And instead, what I want to do is present a reconstructive understanding of capitalism that's inclusive of colonialism and actually sees colonialism as constitutive of capitalism. This is part of a much longer project, but I'm going to present it briefly here because I think it's important to get that sense of a historical understanding in order to be able to sort of really get a sense of what's happening in politics in the moment. And also, I think one of the things that I find really puzzling when doing this research and sort of thinking about these issues is the absolute failure of European scholars to engage with colonialism or to think about it as constitutive of their societies and actually as constitutive of their very possibilities of being. There is no aspect of any institution, anything within Britain that isn't formed by empire and imperial wealth. And so perhaps the explanation for this omission rests in the fact that colonialism did lead to the betterment of the lives of people within Europe, and that there's a failure to wish to reckon with what the consequences of a proper accounting would open up. In contrast, and I'll come to this towards the end, I argue that a properly critical analysis would actually offer us the possibility of better understanding our shared past so that we could more appropriately construct a world in which all of us could live well. But I guess there's the rub. Some of us don't want all of us to live well. So first then, to present a discussion of the history of capitalism. A book came out recently called Capitalism, A Conversation. It was written by the critical theorists Nancy Fraser and Rahel Yegi, who are very much on the left of the spectrum and present an account of a history of capitalism that is somewhat inclusive of ideas of colonialism. And so in part why I would choose to engage with their work is because they've gone some way to thinking about the ways in which colonialism is part of capitalism, but they still present it nonetheless as something separate. And I'll explain how they do that. So they talk about the fact that when people talk about the history of capitalism, they generally talk about it in terms of 4 stages. So first you've got mercantile or commercial capitalism, then liberal or competitive capitalism, then social democratic or welfare capitalism, and then finally financialized capitalism, which they would suggest is what we're living through at the moment. Now, I'm only really going to talk about the first stage, and it's sort of linked through to welfare. And they talk about the first stage of mercantile capitalism as being from the 16th to the 18th centuries. And during this period, they suggest that neither land nor labor was a true commodity, and that what rulers did during this time was to regulate commerce internally and profit from external plunder and long-distance trade. And this was a trade that was organized through what they describe as an expanding world market in luxury commodities. Now, it's not clear to me why they talk about this particular trade, the trade in luxury commodities, as something that was organized capitalistically. Because for me, this would be more appropriately understood in terms of colonialism, because everything they're talking about would not have been possible without the elimination of indigenous peoples in Abiyala, the lands that we now call the Americas, the appropriation of those lands, and the extraction of silver and other resources from them. This is also the period that saw the beginnings of the systematic trade in human beings that would enslave millions of Africans and transport them as commodities to the New World. There they were coerced to work in extractive industries that mined the resources in Abiyala, which were then used to trade with India and China for the luxury commodities. This was before being coerced to work on plantations to produce sugar, cotton, and tobacco for European markets. To suggest, as Fraser does at this point, that neither land nor labor was a true commodity is to fail to take seriously the colonial processes that underpin the possibilities of what is regarded as mercantile capitalism. This is a serious historical misunderstanding, and it's one which reifies a mode of capitalism as abstracted from its conditions in colonialism. This first stage, I would suggest, is much better understood as colonialism through private property. And it's succeeded by colonialism as national project. And this is the process when European states begin the process of seeking to domesticate or incorporate the external activities of private companies through the establishment of direct imperial rule. Now, what constitutes internal or external is central here, because the core European states are always understood as having a theoretical and conceptual integrity as a nation. And so what happens beyond their borders is often not understood as central to understanding their domestic activities. And this goes back to the misunderstanding that I was highlighting earlier about states being nations having empires, instead of more properly being understood as being imperial states. And the difference that would be made, so as I was saying before, if you have a nation that has an empire, you've disaggregated these two processes. If you think of the entirety as an imperial state, you bring within a common frame of reference events, processes, and politics that are otherwise being presented as separate. And it would also be to really recognize the colonial processes through which things like what we call the Industrial Revolution are actually formed and developed. So I'm going to give you an example now. I'm going to present the account of Britain and its relation to India. So Britain's contact with India, sort of would have been much longer as well, but with the establishment of the East India Company in the 1600s, that's the point at which there begins to be systematic trade between Britain and India. And for the first century and a half, it mostly is a trading relationship where initially there's nothing that India or China want from Britain or from Europe more broadly other than bullion, silver. So the commodities that are being produced in India and China are being bought with silver that is being extracted primarily from Southern America, and that's being used to purchase these commodities. This trading relationship fundamentally changes in the mid-18th century when you have the Battle of Plassey. This is a battle which the East India Company fights against French colonists who are also trying to gain a foothold in India, and it's also fought against local Indian rulers. And the East India Company both has a private army but is also supported by the British state. And the Brits win. So the victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1857 turns the East India Company from being an entity that's simply concerned with trade to now governing Bengal with, significantly, tax collecting powers. And what this does is transform the private pillage that had been being carried out by company men into what was to become the state-organized systematic drain of resources. That is, pillage on an industrial scale. So one of the things that's distinctive about the British Empire is the way in which it taxes populations beyond the nation, and it appropriates those taxes for the use by the national government. And I'll go on to talk about why that's significant in a moment. So there's taxation that gets established at that point. There's also the pocketing of profits from enforced monopolies. There's the extraction of resources, transfer of treasure, interest on enforced loans, and so on. Now, the amount of money that was taken from India and sent to Britain is contested, but it's largely accepted that there was a very significant transfer of wealth over the period of colonial rule. One of the first people to make an account of this is Dadabhai Naoroji, who writes in the early 1900s, and people like R.C. Dutt, but their figures are deemed to be sort of on the more extreme end, so I'll just present the figures to you, which are being calculated by Angus Maddison, who's a British economist, and who's understood to present a more conservative estimate. So Maddison argues that during the period of rule by the East India Company, official transfers from India to the UK rose over time until they reached about 3.5 million in 1856. 3.5 million in 1856 would be about 350 million in today's money. As well as extracting that revenue, the East India Company now no longer had to trade for its commodities in bullion and could use the taxes that it collected from the people in order to buy the commodities and transfer those to Britain. And that enabled the East India Company profits to soar to undreamed heights, as the historian John Richards argues. This revenue was then used to conquer and annex territory beyond Bengal and across the Indian subcontinent into Afghanistan and Burma in the early 19th century. The additional territory also brought with it additional populations who were also taxed, which then brought additional revenue, which was then used to fund further annexations. The official transfers from India to Britain didn't include the private remittances, which Naoroji estimates to be about £10 million a year by the late 1880s. This would be the equivalent in today's money of about £1 billion a year. On top of this, the East India Company officials and the European military officers received exceedingly high salaries which then also included a compensation payment for having to work in India and to provide for their families back in Britain, these salaries were hardly taxed, and their pensions were funded by Indian taxes. The salaries of employees in the India office in London were also paid out of Indian revenues and were exempt from income tax. Now, the salaries of East India Company officials and of the employees of the India office in London constituted about 10% of the expenditure. The amount that was spent on public works in India, the railways, always the railways, was barely 2%. So that's just to put that into perspective. In 1857, there is what is called the Indian Mutiny, or the first Indian sort of revolt against British rule, and that leads to the British government taking over direct control of India, because prior to that it's been ruled by the East India Company under the Colonial Office, but now it gets taken over by the government directly. From 1858 to 1947, Angus Maddison suggests that the official transfers of funds, which were known as home charges, were in the range of 40 to 50 million pounds a year by the 1930s. That's about 2.5 billion to 3.2 billion annually is being sent from India to Britain. By the mid-19th century, land tax made up about half of the total revenue, and indirect taxation on salt, opium, and other goods made up about a third. So at a time when in the UK, people paid a gross revenue of about 7% of a much higher income, so about 7% of the entire wealth was coming out of taxes. In British India, they paid a gross revenue of 14.3% of their income to Britain. Now, on the issue of taxation, why it's important, and there is actually a similarity to be made here in terms of what Britain does to India to what Britain also does to Ireland. And the similarity there is the way in which taxes and revenue are extracted from those two sites and are taken for use by the government in Westminster to the absolute detriment both of India and Ireland. And they're the two most similar colonies of Britain in the context of the broader empire. And there was a book that I found by George Wingate, who's a British scholar writing in 1859. And he was quoted by Noroji. And I just want to read this quote out to you because I think it makes the argument about taxes quite clearly. So he says, taxes which are spent in the country in which they are raised are totally different in their effects from taxes raised in one country and spent in another. In the former case, the taxes collected from the population are again returned to industrious classes. So when we pay taxes, we get roads, we get lighting, we get hospitals, we get public education, we get all these things for the taxes that we pay. But the case is wholly different when the taxes are not spent in the country from which they are raised. Then they constitute an absolute loss and extinction of the whole amount withdrawn from the taxed country. Such is the nature of the tribute we have so long exacted from India. From this explanation, some faint conception may be formed of the cruel, crushing effect of the tribute upon India. When Richard Temple, and he was president of a section within the Royal Statistical Society, he brought together all the data that was available on the revenues of the British Empire and presented to the meeting in 1884 the general statistics of British Empire. And he determined that of the £203 million that was at the disposal of the British state for general government, 89 million came from the UK, 74 million came from India, and 40 million came from British territories and the rest of empire. The revenue received by empire for local purposes included an additional £5 million raised in and for use in India. So the 74 million that came from India was for use by the national government in Westminster for its own purposes. There was an additional tax which raised 5 million for administration of the Colonial Office in India itself. On top of this, there were 2 voluntary war gifts to the UK amounting to £150 million, or £10 billion in today's money, that were made in 1917. Further, not only did India contribute nearly 2 million personnel for the war effort, but every aspect of their associated expenditure was paid for by India. And there's a great exhibition that we'll be going to see tomorrow on the contribution made by Indian soldiers to the First World War. After the First World War and during the global depression, Britain's extraction of tribute from India increased significantly, and again with the outbreak of the Second World War. In summary, Utsa Patnaik, an economist working at JNU University in India, drawing on 2 centuries of data on tax and trade, calculated that Britain drained a total of around $45 trillion from India during the period from the Battle of Plassey to the outbreak of the Second World War. Now, I just want to give you an illustration of what a trillion is, because we often use these figures, and it certainly wasn't clear to me until I sort of tried to figure this out, how much it actually was. So imagine that you were given $1 a second. In an hour, you would have $3,600. It would take 1 million seconds to acquire $1 million. 1 million seconds is about 1,700 minutes, or about 11.5 days. So if you were given $1 a second, it would take 11.5 days to get $1 million. It would take you 11,600 days, or 31 years, to accumulate 1 billion at the same rate. So the difference between 1 million and 1 billion is the difference between 11.5 days and 31.7 years. To acquire 1 trillion would take you 31,700 years, 317 centuries. That's how big 1 trillion is. And Britain drained a total of $45 trillion from India in 2 centuries. Now, here I've detailed, by way of illustration, if incomplete, the tribute, taxation, and remittances extracted by Britain from India. And I haven't had time to deal with the lethal consequences of this regime of extraction, primarily famines and the utter impoverishment of the population. Britain also had a number of other colonies, and it organized similar sorts of regimes and extracted income and resources also from them. So how does this now relate to the welfare state? Well, if we think about how welfare was provided within Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, what we see is that it occurred through a mixed economy of limited state interventions, supplemented by the work of voluntary organizations and private charitable activity. So the Victorian age was an age of philanthropy, and I guess one has to ask, where did the money come from that was being given in philanthropy at that time? From the poor laws of the 16th century to the welfare state in the mid-20th, one of the key issues of the government was how was welfare to be financed. There was a careful balance of taxation nationally such that no class or interest group was unduly burdened, and this, as Martin Daunton argues, legitimated the British state internally and ensured the compliance of its national population. It wasn't until the experience of total war, the First World War, that politicians began to consider, and then to agree to, the more extensive deployment of the resources of the nation for collective purposes, eventually leading to the establishment of the welfare state. As Michael Mann has argued, warfare and welfare came together in the idea of the nation as an aggregate of citizens, reinforced through the distribution and redistribution of resources within national boundaries. So I would suggest that a national frame only really came into being in determining the population to whom recompense was to be made in the aftermath of 2 devastating wars and a growing national electorate able to lobby for such demands. The shared experience of these wars by imperial subjects in terms both of military service and the provision of resources has not often been considered. Michael Mann, for example, fails to recognize the solidarity of Indians and other imperial subjects within the British state in terms either of acknowledging their membership within the state or in terms of their claim upon the organization of the resources at its disposal to distribute. His is not a singular failure, it's a typical one. In the context of the welfare state being seen to be a national project for the amelioration of capitalism, it is rarely asked about what is distributed. Where was the surplus generated that is being redistributed? Or if it is asked, as in the case of some Marxist scholars, the answer is given in terms of class relations, again understood in national terms. The welfare state, then, tends to be understood in terms of the nationalization of the state, with little reflection back on the existing imperial nature of that state and the imperial nature of the finances that are being nationalized. In the immediate aftermath of the First World War, there were a number of debates around the feasibility of setting up a system of national welfare that would be funded through taxation. Arthur Bowley, a key economist of his time, in his study, The Division of the Product of National Industry, sought to ascertain the amount of money that could be taken from the rich and added to the wages of the poor, such that it would both alleviate poverty and not be an undue burden on the rich. In making his calculations, Bowley determined the national income, which was made up of the total income of people within the UK, as well as income received from abroad. He deducted the amount that would be necessary for running the government and then divided the remainder by the population of the UK. So to underline, arguments about providing welfare for the poor within Britain took the taxes of Indians and other colonized subjects into account when making their calculations about its feasibility, without ever taking them into account as the recipients of the distribution of this fund. It goes without saying that these taxes, tributes, and remittances were used to fund such schemes as they came into being, just as they'd been used to fund the infrastructure of the state over the past 2 centuries. To return to Mann's argument about welfare and warfare, we also need to understand that warfare was not an exogenous or an external factor to the political systems involved. It was the basis of increased extraction from the colonies, at the same time as welfare began the process of creating social democratic institutions distinct from empire, although funded by it. So taxation of and the extraction of resources from colonial dependencies is part of the explanation for the growth of resources available for the establishment of the domestic welfare state. As such, the state is only able to respond to local working class demands by drawing on resources from elsewhere, and at the same time excluding those colonized others from that distribution of resources. And again, I return to the fact that it's the continued misguided presentation of Britain being a nation, having an empire, that enables scholars to systematically exclude from their considerations populations beyond the national frame, but who are nonetheless part of the imperial polity and who have funded that polity. So to draw this to a conclusion, what I've sought to do is to set out the ways in which colonialism is constitutive of the emergence and development of capitalism and its political institutions, namely the welfare state. In discussing the history of capitalism, I have sought to challenge the familiar stages that most scholars of capitalism accept and to offer an alternative conceptualization that recognizes colonialism as integral to its development and central to the welfare state. This is what, for me, decolonizing the curriculum actually means: to address the inadequate histories that shape the narratives that we are told and to reconfigure them on the basis of more adequate understandings. The purpose of this is to move beyond Euro-centred explanations that fail to acknowledge the significance of forms of colonial appropriation and displacement to the global inequalities that configure our world. There is no wealth or poverty in this world that does not have its roots in the colonial organization of that world. In these terms, the welfare state was not a historic achievement of a domestic working class. It was the amelioration of national conditions of deprivation funded by the labor and resources of colonized subjects who were further immiserated in the process and excluded from any form of redistribution. With the demise of empire in the late 20th century, it's no surprise that the welfare state is itself in question again. While decolonization didn't involve any form of reparation for the previous colonial drain, it did reduce the flow of wealth coming into Britain, with consequences for welfare state finances. And so it's no surprise that the fiscal crisis of the welfare state is simultaneous with decolonization, even if that relation goes unrecognized. Acknowledging the colonial and imperial contexts of what is presented as our national patrimony could facilitate the generation of more extensive solidarities and a post-colonial reparative and redistributive politics that would be to the benefit of us all. This would involve a clear rejection of the nationalistic constructions of undeserving others in order to facilitate new understandings of the meaning of global redistributive justice. It requires, in short, post-colonial reparative action, both epistemological and material. Thank you.